All right, our numbers have stabilized, so I will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone who's joining us. My name is Sarah Kibbe, and I'm a research scientist at the Forest School at the Yale School of the Environment and the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture. And I'm here today with a few of my colleagues to share findings from a new study published last week in the journal Earth's Future. And the study represents work by a team of forest carbon experts convened by the Land Systems Program with the Clean Air Task Force. And this report was co authored by 12 colleagues who had wide ranging expertise in forest carbon management, wildfire risk and prevention, soil carbon science, ecosystem modeling, and anthropogenic impacts on forest biogeochemistry. And today I'm joined here by three of the report and publication co authors: Dr. Lucy Hutira, who's the Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Earth and Environment Department at Boston University, Dr. Matt Hurto, Professor of Biology at the University of New Mexico, and Dr. Rebecca Sanders DeMott, Director of the Ecosystem Carbon Science with the Land Systems Program at Clean Air Task Force. And over the next hour, Lucy, Matt, and Rebecca are going to share with you more details about three key findings of the report. And we will have a little bit of time at the end for audience questions and answers. But first, we found that forest carbon credits are important. Forests and other lands absorb nearly 30% of the carbon dioxide humans emit every year. And carbon credits have a role to play in funding the protection and expansion of this globally important carbon sink. Second, we found that carbon protocols can be strengthened. Our studies showed that there are places for improvement within protocols, as we found that nearly all of the 20 protocols for issuing credits that we reviewed were too weak to ensure that the forest credits issued are guaranteed to be of high quality. And then finally, we identify areas and ways for improvement. And Matt and Lucy and Rebecca will talk about that a little bit more today. But we identify areas where registries and states can strengthen protocols to restore confidence in the market and ensure that forest carbon credits achieve their climate benefits. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Lucy, who co led this study, to set the context for why she initiated this work.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So at the highest level, we have been emitting fossil fuels into our atmosphere, and our climate has been warming. We've been doing this for decades, and over that time, something of a miracle has happened, where not all of the CO2 emissions that we put in the air stay there. About half of the CO2 that we emit through combustion of fossil fuels stays in the atmosphere, and the rest of it goes elsewhere. So we're not feeling the full brunt of the potential climate warming from our emissions. About 30% of our annual fossil fuel CO2 emissions are taken up by land, particularly forests. And this is amazing. And it's something that has varied on an interannual basis depending on El Niños and fires and but this has been happening for decades. And it's crucial as we think about how we can effectively tackle the climate challenges before us. So the concept of forest carbon offsets and forest carbon credits is actually pretty simple. It's to sell credits for a ton of carbon. A ton of carbon is about 5,000 miles a year of driving. To sell a credit for those emissions that are going into the atmosphere that offsets it by doing a different action to increase the amount of carbon that's taken up by land. So for example, those 5,000 miles of driving could be equivalent to the amount of carbon that 50 trees take up on a landscape. And it sounds very simple, where if we can change our management behaviors to increase that sink, we could make that land sink that we know is happening even stronger and offset some of these fossil fuel emissions. This is great, but the devil is in the details on this. I threw out 50 trees can take up a ton of carbon, but that really depends on the size of the trees, where the trees are located, where they are developmentally, and there's a lot of details around this. And over the last couple of years, the market has been selling credits like this, but there's been a lot of uncertainty about how real are these credits, where the forest carbon sink is unequivocally real. But some of these credits may not be changing the amount of carbon that these forests are taking up. Next slide. And so there's been a lot of criticism about the way that the market is working and the rule set around that. But there's also been a lot of attention to our need for doing these sorts of actions to increase that land sink. And so there's been, on the right, you can see some of the headlines that have come around about changes and enhancements and additional activity in this forest carbon space, including a lot that's happening on the international level through the Conference of the Parties, and actions that are happening in the private sector with companies like Google, Meta, Microsoft, Salesforce, making very large pledges around enhancing the land carbon sink through removals. Next. And in order to meet many of the targets that we've put forth on reducing our warming across the planet, forests are part of the solution set to get there. But given the current rule set that's operating for these carbon credits, there's just a lot of uncertainty around that. And there's a really strong need right now to revisit and strengthen the rule set that is governing these carbon credit markets in order to have a future that these sorts of credits will be believed and will be real. Next. And so as a group, we've worked to try to tackle this problem, but in order to go to the next step, we've published a beautiful paper with some findings and specific explicit suggestions, but this is something that is larger than what this author set can tackle. And so we're putting forth some ideas for this on how we can strengthen the system, how we can change what some of this rule set looks like to have rigor, transparency, and a real climate impact from these credits that are being sold. Rebecca. Rebecca, you're muted.
Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, so in that spirit, as you know, a group of experts who are very aware of the power of the forest carbon sink, we wanted to dig into the details of these protocols to really understand, you know, why is it happening that we are having sometimes weak credit certified, and what does that look like, and how could it be improved? So our framing question here was to look at the system as it exists and ask, do forest carbon protocols ensure that credits are consistently high quality? And so the first piece of this, as I mentioned, we took a really critical look at what's out there right now. We came together as a group to get deep in the weeds, share our perspectives and our expertise, and for the current approaches that we see across protocols against what we think should be possible, given the state of science. And we pulled out specific approaches that protocols use across 18 key features and scored them. We weighted those features relative to one another so we could aggregate scores together. And then we rolled those scores up for each protocol. The second thing we did, though, is as a group, we discussed and tried to highlight key areas where we think there's uncertainty, areas of concern that need some additional focus. And then we developed a list of specific recommendations or ideas that we think would help push these protocols where they need to be, so that that answer to this framing question can be yes moving forward. And we looked at protocols covering 3 different project types. So avoided conversion projects, where the project intervenes to protect a forest that's at risk of being converted to another land use. Afforestation or reforestation projects, where new forests are planted on land that is not currently forest, but either could be or has been in the not so distant past. And also improved forest management projects, which are very varied and span a range of practices designed to increase carbon sequestration in forests under management. things like extending rotation age and silvicultural practices that retain or promote carbon stock on site. We constrained our sample of protocols to those with relevance to North America to reflect our expertise. And since some of these protocols cover multiple project types, if a protocol involved multiple project types within one general set of rules, we scored them separately. So we had a total of 30 scores for each protocol by project type. And just to clarify, we did not include red protocols in this study due to our geographic relevance and to best align with our expertise. So those 18 features that we examined were distributed across 4 important components of protocol structure. We looked at features related to non-permanent risk assessment and reduction of that risk. We looked at features related to how projects are required to demonstrate that they are additional and how they are intended to estimate the baseline. So what would have happened in absence of the project? And we sort of considered those 2 concepts really interlinked. We looked at what are the requirements and rules and technologies for quantification and monitoring of those carbon stocks over time. And then we looked at how protocols account for the indirect emissions or the issue of leakage. So how implementing the project in one area might impact carbon emissions elsewhere. And what we found when we rolled all this up was that based on our criteria and our scoring, we found that most of the protocols right now scored as weak or lower for their ability to ensure that credits are high quality. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt now to talk about some of the implications and where we think we should go from here.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. So, as Rebecca mentioned, and we each evaluated all of these protocol by project combinations. It was really interesting to see where folks kind of zeroed in on some of the challenges that are faced, and there's specific project types have specific sets of challenges, but real briefly. Of the 3 project types we evaluated, the afforestation, reforestation, so planting trees to take up carbon, avoided conversion would be stopping the loss of forest due to development or land use change. And then one that is especially variable is the improved forest management project type. And, really at its most basic level, it's about undertaking some management activity to increase the amount of carbon sequestered on that patch of ground over and above what would have occurred in the absence of the project. So changing your management behavior in some way in order to store more carbon on the landscape. And so each of these project types offered some challenges. But as Rebecca mentioned, kind of the punchline is that of the 30 protocol by project combinations that we evaluated, 27 of them were rated as weak or very weak by our group, and only 3 were satisfactory. And so if the objective of a particular protocol is to really ensure that a forest carbon offset from one project developed under that protocol is equivalent to forest carbon offset developed as part of a different project under that protocol, to make sure those are equivalent, and then those are also equivalent to avoiding a ton of fossil carbon emissions, the majority of these protocols are unlikely to meet that objective because of the variability and the opportunity for kind of a choose your own adventure approach to making assumptions in project development. Next slide, please. So we identified, as Rebecca mentioned, these areas that we evaluated. We identified opportunities for improvement in each of those 4 main categories. So in non-permanence risk reduction, improvements that could be made in determining additionality and developing baselines, and then quantifying carbon stocks, and then monitoring, and also leakage. And we'll get into those in some detail shortly. But then we also identified some opportunities for improvements in terms of the overall market structure. And so generally speaking, there needs to be improved transparency across these different programs in terms of both data and assumptions. And so if projects are required to make their data publicly available and the like, that's an opportunity for people to get a look under the hood and gain some trust in the process that's going into developing those offsets. Similarly, we also identified an opportunity for whether or not there's, real or even perceived conflict of interest, but an opportunity to separate validation verification body relationships from project developer relationships. So more of a systemic process to allocate validation and verification effort across projects could be an opportunity to improve the system as a whole. And I'll stop there and we'll go into a bit more detail here, but I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Lucy, Rebecca, and Matt for giving that overview. I'm going to ask each of you a few questions where we can dig in a little bit more to the areas of improvement and some of those recommendations that Matt just shared. So first, Lucy, I want to ask you a little bit about how protocols assist additionality and determined baselines, which was one of those first elements that we found areas for improvement. And just for those in the audience who might not be familiar with the terms additionality or baselines, this idea of additionality is really central pillar to carbon crediting programs writ large, forest and beyond. And it just requires that any carbon benefit that comes from an action be directly responsible from that carbon payment or that intervention. And so in other words, we want to see that carbon gains are not passive to forest just growing, but actually in response to some active intervention or active protection of a forest carbon stock. And so, for example, if a landowner was never going to harvest their forest in the first place and conserve it, it would be non-additional to pay that landowner to continue conserving a forest that they were going to conserve. But what's really important to know is additionality is really tough to assess. It's actually it's impossible to, once we pay a landowner to perform an activity on a forest, to then understand what that landowner would have done into the future as that baseline or that counterfactual or alternative. And so because additionality is so hard to assess, it's been one of the pinch points for carbon markets over the past decade. And so Lucy, could you just share a little bit too first of what did you find, or what did we find about how protocols are assessing additionality? And then what are some methods that you recommend adopting, or even methods that we see currently being adopted in some of the newer protocols that can address some of these concerns and uncertainties?
Thanks, Sarah. You framed that up really well. And in our analysis, we ended up really putting together two concepts. Additionality, which you described, of trying to know that we're paying a credit for something that wasn't already going to happen, something that is additional. And in many cases in the earlier protocols, the criteria for determining something that was additional was that it wasn't already required by regulation in some way. So you were doing something that was above and beyond what regulation would require, and it was also above and beyond what common practice was. The other piece that we ended up coupling to additionality is this notion of baselines. Because as forests grow over time, it's the difference between the baseline expectation of what would have happened at this forest versus what is happening at this forest. And it's the delta, it's the difference between those two that we're really crediting. Now, if the baseline assumption is a really low forest growth rate and the observed growth rate is much higher, you could yield a much more credits that can be sold for that. And so the question gets very tightly and quickly coupled between additionality of, is this happening because the credit is being paid, but also how much credit are we talking about? And so this question of baselines is really difficult because every site has a unique site history and conditions that drive how much carbon it's going to take up. And if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, this problem would be a lot harder than it is today. For a long time, one of the best practices was using a model called FVS, the Forest Vegetation Simulator, to estimate how a forest would grow given a given location and forest type. But we can do better now. And one of the key recommendations was to implement dynamic baselines so that that difference that we're estimating is not just a static value that's monotonically increasing over time in many cases, but is reflecting what is happening in the region surrounding this forest, where it's capturing things like shifting deforestation trends, shifting policies, and shifting growth rates with age, structure, and climate change. And we can do that now in a way that we couldn't do it a few years ago because we have more observations on the ground through programs that are intentionally and actively monitoring the amount of forest biomass that we have in place, but also through remote sensing and modeling techniques, where we have satellites that can really quite robustly estimate vegetation types, the height of the vegetation, and the amount of carbon that's in place at those sites. And if we take matching approaches, we could get a really accurate estimate of a forest like this in the absence of the credit that we've issued would have this much biomass. And so we could get much better estimates of how much additional carbon has been credited at the site. And I think that was one of the biggest innovations that we've had in the science, and innovations that should similarly be reflected in the protocols.
And importantly, we had found that some of the newer protocols have already started adopting these dynamic baseline techniques, which is really great to see, and also suggesting that it can move, right? It's already transitioning and moving forward. So great.
Absolutely. That's a really important point. When at the time that we did this analysis, those rule sets were already changing, but no credits had yet been issued under those new rule sets. But the direction was clear, and it was a much more robust and transparent direction that it was going.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lucy. Next up, Matt, I'm going to turn to you as our wildfire expert, and I want to ask you about another element of protocol design where we found there were a lot of opportunities for improvement and strengthening the underlying science, and that was how protocols assess the permanence or durability of carbon credits. And so again, for those in the audience, permanence is another key pillar of carbon crediting, where we want to be able to know how long that carbon is going to be stored, taken from the atmosphere and stored in that forest carbon pool, especially if that credit is going to turn around to be used to offset other emissions coming from different places. And so while forests can certainly store carbon for hundreds to thousands of years under low and limited disturbance regimes, we're also seeing increasing disturbance on the landscape. And so there's questions about how do we mitigate the risk of losing that carbon or having a reversal of carbon back to the atmosphere? And then what do we do in the chances when there is a wildfire or some other natural disturbance that comes through and we do see a reversal in that carbon? And so Matt, just like I asked Lucy, can you tell us just a little bit about how are protocols currently assessing reversal risks and where are the opportunities for improvement?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I think one of the things that's pretty universal in the carbon offset land is the idea of dealing with this non-permanence risk through a buffer pool. So it's, functionally an assurance scheme for the program. So a project as it's being developed, the project developers have to assess the risks to that project, and then allocate a proportion of the offsets generated or credits generated from that project to this buffer pool, which serves as an insurance scheme for any reversal that happens across the entire program, so the entire system, all the projects in that program. And there have been several examples where in the U.S. where these buffer pools have had to be tapped because of big wildfires. And so you'll have a disturbance event occurs that ends up impacting a large fraction of a project area and reverses more offsets than the thing is generated. And then you have to go to the buffer pool to compensate for that. And so really, though, the problem with our current system is that, most of these programs have some sort of prescribed risk value that's not a function of actual project risk. And so about 15 years ago or so, in the much earlier iterations of a lot of these programs and protocols, the protocols didn't even account for the fact that there were things like fire that are likely to occur, and that, there are management actions that can make it the impacts of fire worse or lessen the impacts of fire, basically alter those disturbance outcomes. And really the first step in tackling that was to come up with a process where, they had some predefined risk value for each of these disturbances. And, as a first step, that was a great improvement over the, let's ignore that disturbance occurs, and actually account for that to some degree. The unfortunate circumstances, though, the protocols have pretty much stopped in terms of their their evolution up to this point, and the way they deal with accounting for that risk. And so over the last 15 years, much like Lucy was saying, our ability to quantify carbon, our ability to model carbon has improved. Same goes for our ability to quantify disturbance risk across landscapes and model that into the future. And so we've got a much more robust understanding now, which offers an opportunity to really integrate that information into assessing risk in these carbon offset projects. And so one of our main recommendations was that we have independent data sets developed and regularly updated to quantify both the spatial distribution of that risk and the severity of that risk. And these data protocols should be at a spatial scale that is appropriate for project size, right? So you don't want to have like a 1 kilometer grid when you've got, small projects, particularly for, private lands in the east or something like that. You need to have the scale be appropriate. And then the other challenge that we're facing currently is that because these reversal risk values have been prescribed, there's a high likelihood that a lot of these buffer pools are really undercapitalized, given the actual risk that projects are facing. And so if a disturbance impacts a large carbon project, the potential really exists that a lot of offsets that people have purchased are reversed, and then what those folks have paid for no longer exists. And from the atmosphere's perspective, there's more carbon in the atmosphere. And so really, given the relationship between atmospheric dryness and forest area burned, and then drought stress and insect susceptibility of trees, the probability that reversal risk is increasing over time. The probability that's going to occur is increasing over time. And the offset programs really need to account for that changing risk profile. And so that's going to require that these projects, the risk get evaluated regularly, and that, the evaluation at the project scale, the system needs to account for the fact that that's going to change, and that maybe a risk rating is going to go up over time, and it's going to require larger contributions over time, or more contributions to that buffer pool. So, in our evaluation, though, much as Lucy noted with, Sarah noted with updates to protocols, we did find the American Carbon Registry's recently adopted a new risk tool that uses some external data sets to evaluate fire and insect risk. And this is certainly a step in the right direction. But we need to make more progress in this area, and then we need to adequately manage that risk over time and account for that risk and how those risks will change. You're muted, Sarah.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matt. And it sounds like there's a real opportunity for any scientist out there to start working to integrate these new data streams and modeling tools to create these independent data sets that can be used to support these ongoing risk assessments, because they're of course costly and time consuming to construct and put together. So that's perfect. All right, thanks. And so last up, Rebecca, I'm going to turn to you to talk about the third element of the protocols where we thought there was room for improvement, which has to do with leakage. And the idea of leakage, for those on the call, is that we don't want to see negative ripple effects from any activity that we apply in the landscape. So, for example, if we stop harvesting a forest or we delay a harvest within a forested landscape and there's still demand for that wood product, we don't want the forest next door or the forest in the state over to be harvested in lieu of the forest that we've delayed the harvest on, because that would then represent more emissions to the landscape. And this is, of course, one of the trickiest areas in carbon markets that we've been dealing with for many decades. But Rebecca, can you tell us what we found across the protocols in terms of how they were assessing leakage, and then again, where are the opportunities for improvement and more robust science to help out?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I do want to emphasize the point that this is a very, very complex part of these protocols. The sort of indirect effects, indirect emissions are challenging both within the context of forest carbon protocols and within other contexts related to land use and biomass resources. So this is really, really tricky and thorny. And what we did was we looked at sort of the whole approach to leakage by project type, because the project type really impacts the risk of leakage and the type of leakage that might occur as a result of these projects. And so specifically, these protocols are sort of categorized into activity shifting leakage, where the project causes a carbon emitting activity that might have been happening at the project site, agriculture or logging, to be shifted to another location outside of the project boundary to compensate for the change. And then sort of the market leakage, the commodities market is focused on when a project activity reduces the supply, in this case of timber, into the market, and leads to some market readjustments that could result in that timber harvest just shifting somewhere else. And both of these kinds of leakage could really significantly undermine the carbon benefits of a project. To what extent they undermine those carbon benefits is the part that's really hard to figure out. So for avoided conversion projects, these protocols typically use default factors just applied to the whole project. So the risk that taking a forest that might have been converted or was planned to be converted to another land use type and keeping it as a forest, there are sort of default factors applied to cover that risk in general. For afforestation, reforestation, there's a lot larger range of approaches. And so if you are reforesting or afforesting a piece of land, that land may be currently used for something else, which is a knowable feature of the project. And so we found that some of these protocols require sort of a bespoke assessment of, the value of that land and the service and its use, and how likely it is to be shifted somewhere else, whereas others really rely on sort of a set of default factors based on the existing land use, and that the default factors may range quite a bit in their magnitude. And these all relate to then applying deductions to the overall carbon credits that are issued from the project to account for this risk of leakage. Improved forest management projects, again, because they represent such a wide range of activities, also had a much wider range of approaches to estimating leakage. So there were a lot of very detailed and complex requirements for, a project-specific assessment of market leakage risk, of how much reduction in timber harvest might impact timber harvest somewhere else. Many of these protocols forbid the displacement of a logging activity from one enrolled area of land just to somewhere else within an individual landowner holding. But even that, there were varying extents to which sort of evidence that is not the case is required over time. And then there were also some interesting approaches looking at quantifying the magnitude of harvest reduction, comparing that to the relative stocking density of the project site within the region. So there are some really interesting, thoughtful ways to try and get at this. But we were also struck by the variability and how different it is. And the fact that, one protocol and another might be taking very, very different approaches. Another approach that really stood out for improved forest management involved just forbidding any reduction in harvest on the land that was being enrolled. And this, of course, doesn't apply to all kinds of improved forest management activities. But you can imagine that if there is no reduction in harvest, just a sort of, more sustainable practices being put in place so that the emissions of this harvest is less intense, there isn't the same risk of market leakage. Ultimately, though, we truly were just struck by the range of approaches and recognizing that our team of scientists, our expertise is not in forest economics as much as in forest, but we recognize this is a really, really important piece that needs additional development, additional research, because it is so clear that the risk of leakage is really context dependent, where these projects are happening, what is going on around them at that time, and how things are going to change over the next several decades of project activity. So we'd really like to see the advancement and adoption of new science that draws not just on the existing features, but looks at, a much more location specific treatment, with better attention to economic trends, changing regulations and policy, like Paris, for example, that can be dynamic and responsive to change over time. And so we sort of the call to action would really like to see that kind of work being developed and integrated.
Awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. And then one more final question for you, and looping back around to Lucy's first introduction. Of course, this work is coming at a time when there's many other groups who are also sort of contemplating the same issue of protocol standardization and protocol improvement for high quality credits. And so groups like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets are also performing this sort of external evaluation of standards. And Lucy mentioned Paris Agreements negotiations, specifically on Article 6.4, which are informing international markets and how nations and corporations can engage. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you see this work as our lead author informing and fitting and complementing into these other external existing efforts in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's great to see all of this action. As Lucy pointed out, there's really an opportunity here on many levels to integrate change and move things forward. And we're seeing that movement happen. And so the ICVCM is an initiative led by carbon market actors to set like a harmonized minimum standard for voluntary carbon markets across all kinds of credits, not just forest certainly being included in that. And similarly, the Article 6.4 crediting mechanism will specifically sort of set the standard to inform the international trade of carbon credits under the Paris Agreement. So in contrast, our project team is not specifically affiliated with any carbon market entity. We're coming at this from the perspective of our forest science expertise. And we were able to dig in a little more on the details of this specific subset of protocols focused on forestry than these broader systems, these broader initiatives are looking at. But what is similar is both, certainly ICVCM is really focused on the protocol level. And so making sure the protocol sets the bar, the rules of the road for how credits are issued, and that there is consistency and harmonization among that is really important. And so we think that these findings and recommendations can inform that process as it continues over time. I know it is intended to be sort of an evolving process. We do have many of the protocols that were assessed in our study are currently under review. One of them has been approved, as far as I understand, under the ICVCM. And so we really hope to kind of exchange in dialogue there, take this report and lift it up to those other processes.
Great. Thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to now turn it over. I see that we have lots of questions coming in from the audience, and please feel free to continue peppering us with questions as we move forward through the Q&A feature. And I'll just say up front, we do have a fair number of questions, and so if we don't get to all of the questions, we'll put up a slide at the end that, or Rebecca's going to pop it up right here. Please jot this down or screenshot this. Please feel free to reach out to Rebecca and her colleagues at Clean Air Task Force, who'd be happy to get into any of the questions that we're not able to address today, or any questions that you want to continue discussing. So I want to kick off with a question that came in that I think is really at the heart of the challenges of creating these standards and protocols, that has to do with this sort of inherent trade-off between the accessibility of a protocol to a lot of people, and then the standardization or the specificity that that protocol can achieve. And so the specific question is, in the carbon markets, protocols are generally written to be as broadly applicable as possible so that they can be used across the widest range of scenarios. But when you look at the shortcomings of these protocols, where do you see the trade-off between this more specificity? So, right, narrowing into these areas of more specificity for particular settings versus enabling the greatest volume of carbon to be sequestered in biological sinks. So I'll let you all decide who wants to take a stab at answering that first. But how do we raise the bar with not making it so specific to a specific area that we don't achieve this great mitigation potential for us?
I'm happy to take a first crack, Sarah. I think, it's kind of like the finding as it related to non-permanence risk. It's about accounting for the variability across space, and you can have a protocol that references something, some general tool like that has very specific information for a particular geographic location, right? And so I think that really is kind of the punchline of our findings in terms of like, how do you ensure high quality offsets are developed consistently? It's that, you have as much of this external data that's very much spatially specific, and updated regularly, available to project developers and landowners, and that's how you tackle that. And I'll stop there.
Rebecca or Lucy, do you want to chime in? Or cool. Well, thanks. Oh, go ahead, Lucy.
No, I think Matt covered it pretty well. There was one of the questions touched on how much disagreement there was among the authors in some of these rankings, and this was a point where we had a lot of discussion, because if it becomes too prescriptive and too difficult, it becomes too specific, additional observations required on the ground, and it can become prohibitively specific. And we had a lot of debate on this point. But this is a space where the science has also advanced a lot in recent years, where we just have a lot more information available through newer techniques that can inform a lot of that. And so I think that mitigates this challenge to some extent.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with both of you. And when I reflect on our conversations that we had too, it really does tee us up as scientists to start producing these tools that are available to support. But I think one of the things that came up, and this is very unfortunate timing in the world, and especially in the United States, in terms of funding and infrastructure to do this. But that once we create these methods and tools, someone has to maintain them. Someone has to continue collecting the data, and someone has to maintain them, because otherwise they become static and old very quickly. And so I actually think one challenge that we're going to need to move forward, if we want to demand this specificity, like this point level specificity, is figuring out what is the infrastructure that's going to support not just the creation of these maps or these tools that are geographically, but also the maintenance of them moving forward. And so I think that's, like, looking ahead, a really key challenge that we should all start thinking about now. Another question that came in has to do with transparency. So as the study calls to further increase transparency and address these integrity issues, what additional information is needed, and what specific information are the panelists looking for that isn't currently publicly available?
I can take that one to start, and then others, please feel free to jump in. I think so. One thing that came up in trying to put this paper together was just to get at how many credits have been issued under different versions of these protocols. And in some cases, we had a really hard time tracking down which protocol version, not necessarily just the protocol, but which version, which is important because they evolve over time, um, was tagged to which specific credit. And so that's really one sort of simple point. I think a lot of the other elements of transparency relate not just to the information being available, but to it being accessible. And so there is a lot of information in project reports, but knowing enough as someone on the buyer end of this market to dig into that and find that information if they want to verify things is really challenging. And sometimes it's just not provided in a format that's very usable or searchable, and trying to collate information across a lot of these projects is really challenging. And so that was just something we encountered in this analysis, that we think would be important, but happy to let others speak to that as well.
Matt or Lucy, you have anything to add to Rebecca? Great. Yeah, I think there is just an information backlog again, and this has to do, I think what we're sort of hitting on is this, like adapting to the change in technology and availability of science. But, databases have moved a long way since they first started coming online. And so making databases that are easier to scrape data from and getting information from, pages and pages of protocol documentation into an easy format to read and review is something that hopefully will come online, as well as I know I've heard of people using AI tools and other tools to scrape these documents to provide a lot of that data. So I think we have time for one more question before we close out. It has to do with actually our internal discussions, which is I'm curious if you could speak to the level of agreement within the group of experts on the methodologies and their scores. Were there any categories assessed that had greater differences in assessment within the groups of experts? And, I'll just add on also areas where there was a lot more alignment. And maybe Rebecca, you can lead us off as the lead analysis and author of all of our scores.
Sure. Yeah, it was a really, really active conversation. I think there was a lot of learning and difficult sharing of perspectives. So there was disagreement. I think primarily there was a lot of discussion about the proper monitoring period for these types of credits. So the amount of time that the carbon is monitored and ensured to be stored away varies quite a bit over these protocols, from a couple of decades to 100 years. In some cases, there's a protocol that uses a system that only credits a very small fraction of carbon for the amount of time that has already been stored in a 10-year accounting, right? And so this concept of how long the carbon needs to be stored to qualify as a high quality credit. There was a lot of debate about that because there are some real trade-offs between actual tractability, making these projects doable on the ground, on the landscape, versus what we might want to see for certain use cases of these credits ultimately. So I think that was one area of discussion. As Lucy mentioned, this tension between specificity, prescriptive approaches that really minimize the opportunity for gaming or interpretation, but that also then don't necessarily allow for really high quality information that's project specific where it does exist. And so I think that was another key point of tension, which percolated through several of the components, right? That impact how we assess baseline and additionality, as well as the risk assessment procedures, and certainly should impact leakage as well. And so I really think those were the two key areas where we had a lot of disagreement, and how that played out maybe looks different across those different categories. Whereas I think ultimately our recommendations shift towards much more prescriptive approaches using new data for as it relates to baselines over time. Maybe we had and for risk, there were elements where we wanted to see that project specificity integrated as well. For example, not just take a blanket risk assessment map, but allow for integration of what species are actually present and to those particular species, are they resistant to certain insects or disease? So I'll leave it to anyone else to kind of add additional color.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Lucy.
I was just going to add that, as we had these conversations, the way that we approached doing this ranking was each of us did pre-work where we did all the reading and we did an initial ranking around all the categories that you see described in the paper. And then we came together for multiple days and we discussed it all. And through those discussions, if the individuals wanted to, those scores that were given could be changed, which I think was one of the really beautiful parts of what we did, because we each come with our own expertise into this room, and this group was trying to capture a broad expertise, and we learned from one another, and some of the scores for individual protocols did shift following the discussion and others didn't. And in our presentation of these evaluations, we were intentionally transparent in that to show what the range of opinion on the robustness of these different protocols and different protocol elements was. Matt?
Yeah, I think the other thing to keep in mind too, I mean, we had 12 researchers involved in this, and you get 12 researchers marching in a similar direction on anything, it's a fairly strong statement. And I think that the variance in terms of our scores was actually fairly narrow in most cases. I think the variance was probably a little higher in ways to improve the current process, because everybody did bring their own specific expertise to that discussion. And I think, our discussions yielded approaches that would draw on those different types of expertise, those different backgrounds, to come up with the best solution that we could, given what our group of 12 brought to the table. I wanted to add while we're here though, is that there was also someone asked a question about an updated protocol that we hadn't included. And I think one of the things that's really important and that we've talked about a bit as a group is that these protocols get updated, and that's fantastic. Our whole reason for doing this was to kind of chart a course forward, right? Make some recommendations where our expertise could help improve outcomes. And, so we want to see protocols improve, but the improvements aren't universal yet, right? There's a lot of variability between the different protocols. And then the other thing is even after all of the protocols, if they do get updated and all of these things do improve, there's still a lot of offsets in the market that have been sold that were generated under those older versions that still will have problems. They'll still, contribute to systemic risk, reversal risk in these systems and the like. And so one of the discussions that needs to occur is how to deal with that, right? How do we deal with offsets developed under older protocols and the challenges that those face?
And I will just end before Rebecca, turning it back to you to give more information of where we find is one thing that I think is interesting about this. Like, we've been narrowing into thinking about forest protocols, but it's also good sometimes to look up and think about where forest sits within the larger space of emissions reductions and carbon dioxide removal. And the one place that we didn't have a lot of recommendations, and I think that we scored well, was in our ability to measure and some of the novel tools and adaptations. And a few of our colleagues on this paper are experts in remote sensing and carbon measurement and management, both on the ground or from remote sense data. And so I want to just also say we're not talking about the measurement of carbon, because there was a lot of confidence that this was an area that it's solid. And I think that's important to remember in the larger landscape of carbon dioxide removal strategies and climate mitigation strategies, is that we can measure this stuff and there's room for improvement, but we can move things forward now today on the ground to maximize those benefits. So I apologize, we didn't get to all the questions in the Q&A, but some of the ones that I skipped over were a little more specific and actually segue into Rebecca. If you could tell us just a little bit more about where people can find more information. There's questions about scoring of specific protocols. There's also just questions about more of the methodological details about the protocols. So could you share a little bit more about where people can go to find more in-depth information, and also what's coming next from Clean Air Task Force moving forward on this project?
Yes, definitely. So we have all of this information available online, starting at the the key bullet points down to the all of the details that we analyze. So if you go to this website, you'll find links to the report, an executive summary, the paper in Earth Future that was published with sort of all of the details. There's also a data set that's publicly available that's linked from the paper as supplemental information. We have a downloadable scorecard in an Excel file available on that website. And again, that data set, which is linked from the scorecard and the Earth's Future paper, provides all of the details of the methodology and how we actually scored these protocols. And so if you have trouble finding any of that, please feel free to reach out to us at the email here as well. And so moving forward, we're really hoping to work to integrate these recommendations and help move forward some of these recommendations and improvements, and help shine a light on where they're happening, push for improvements where we need to see them, tap into the policy discussion so we can help sort of drive support for these kinds of improvements. And we're also looking into other ways to finance forest carbon, right? So carbon credit and the carbon markets is one way, but there are alternative ways, and in some cases, maybe those alternative systems are even more appropriate in situations where measuring is really difficult, or the challenges that we've outlined are sort of insurmountable. We can just support improved practices on the ground. So we'll be looking into developing some recommendations on those alternative funding and finance opportunities for forests as well. I also want to mention we'll be Clean Air Task Force is convening another group of experts to evaluate protocols related to biomass carbon removal and storage. And we think this model was really effective. We learned a lot, and we want to take it to a different system that's becoming increasingly important as we think about the landscape of carbon dioxide.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. And with just 1 minute left today, I just want to thank everyone who was able to join us. And thank you, Lucy, Rebecca, and Matt for also joining and talking about. And just to, end us off, remember that forest carbon credits are important, and carbon credits have a role to play in funding the protection and expansion of a carbon sink that absorbs currently roughly 30% of the carbon dioxide and has even greater potential. That crediting protocols still have areas in places where they can be strengthened. Our study showing that there are places for improvement, and we identify these areas and ways for improvement. And Matt and Lucy and Rebecca shared a lot of the places and opportunities that we have today, including as scientists, to contribute to this goal of making sure that forests are doing what we want them and need them to do in our hopefully low temperature climate future. So thanks very much, everyone. We appreciate your time, and we can all sign off.
Thank you.
And thank you, Sarah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much.